It's not bad. It's not great. It's just fine. Last month, when I put out a video talking about my issues with the Spider-Man fandom and the current state of Spider-Man comics, I specifically avoided talking about the recent Ultimate Spider-Man title written by Jonathan Hickman. And that's because I have a whole host of thoughts about Ultimate Spider-Man itself, and I thought it was worth making its own video to express those thoughts. Thoughts about Hickman as a writer, thoughts about the pacing, thoughts about the way characters are portrayed, and thoughts about the fandom's response to the title. So now it's time to take a look at Ultimate Spider-Man. Hello and welcome to the Chemist's Codex. My name is Peter and I like to tell stories about whatever catches my interest because I believe those stories can teach us more about ourselves. So while this video is sort of a companion piece to my previous Spider-Man video, you don't need to watch that one in order to watch this one. Although if you haven't seen the previous video, you should definitely check it out. I think it's a good video and I put a lot of thought and time into it. But getting to the topic at hand, let's turn our attention to Ultimate Spider-Man. When the title first launched, the reception to it was quite positive. I saw heaps of praise, and I will admit the first few issues were pretty solid. But then it kind of started to go downhill. Things started to feel rather rushed, what you would think would be important moments or significant changes were happening in between issues, and we never got to actually see them happen. And it started to feel like Spider-Man was a side character in his own book. But let's back up a bit. I think I should give a bit of an explanation behind the premise of Ultimate Spider-Man and this specific Ultimate Universe before I get into my comments about the book. This actually starts back in the early 2000s, believe it or not. Marvel launched their new line of comics under the Ultimate banner. This was a new universe without the 40-some odd years of continuity to keep track of. It was meant to serve as a way to bring in new readers. And this new Ultimate Universe was reasonably successful, since it lasted until 2015, but arguably the most successful title was Ultimate Spider-Man. But once this universe had been running for about a dozen years, it ran into the problem that it was meant to fix. It had too much of a backlog of continuity for readers to keep track of. So then, as part of the 2015 Secret Wars event, Marvel ended up ending the Ultimate Universe, taking the things that people actually liked and moving them into the main 616 continuity. It was pretty much just Miles Morales. But there was another character that was brought over, the Maker. This character is who the Ultimate Universe Reed Richards ended up becoming. He became a megalomaniacal villain who would attempt to manipulate events in order to strengthen his own power. And that's what brings us to the recent iteration of the Ultimate Universe. See, what happened was the Maker gained access to time travel, so he went back in time and prevented every superhero from ever gaining their powers, manipulating events so they would be more or less normal people. The Maker set up a new timeline where he was the ruler of the world, but then Tony Stark learned the truth about what the Maker did and sent out packages to those who should have been superheroes. Packages that would help them become the heroes they were meant to be. And one of those packages was sent to Peter Parker. So when we meet this version of Peter, who never became Spider-Man, he's married to Mary Jane and they have two kids, Richard and May. Peter is a photographer for the Daily Bugle, where Uncle Ben is a reporter. And honestly, this is a pretty solid setup. And I think this is what got most people to read it, because Ultimate Spider-Man started while Amazing Spider-Man was still in the much maligned Zeb Wells era. So it seemed that the main draw was seeing Peter married to Mary Jane with kids. That's what got a lot of people to read the title, and that's what seemed to get a lot of early praise. But like I said, things kind of started to go downhill, and in my opinion, a lot of that has to do with Jonathan Hickman himself. Because Hickman was the main architect behind this new Ultimate Universe. He's the one who wrote the introductory comic setting everything up, and he's the one who wrote Ultimate Spider-Man. And admittedly, this is just a personal thing, but I'm not really a fan of Jonathan Hickman. Which isn't to say I think he's a bad comic book writer, rather the way he writes isn't to my personal taste. I view Hickman in very much the same way I view Christopher Nolan. He is very talented at what he does, and he can often do it very well, but I just never really connect with the stories he wants to tell. I find that Hickman is great at coming up with a concept and developing the ideas around that concept, but when it comes to the execution, it tends to fall a little flat. And for me, it really comes down to the characters. I find the way he writes just about any character makes them come off as cold and calculating. And I have an example of Hickman's writing being kind of awkward that I like to point to. I don't remember exactly where this comes from. I believe it's from X of Swords, back when Hickman was spearheading the Krakoan Age comics. It was ancient before that word existed, but not yet old in the way they were old. Yeah, I'm not really sure what that means. It feels like an overly complicated way of saying it's old, but this other thing is older. Do you get what I mean? It just comes off as needlessly convoluted for the sake of being convoluted. But for what it's worth, I do think that Ultimate Spider-Man is one of the better examples of Hickman's writing, but that's more so in the language he uses, not as much in the way the characters are portrayed. So I might as well get into that. Let's start off by looking at Peter Parker's characterization. Frankly, my biggest complaint is that he's just kind of boring. This version of Peter is shown to be a kind of generic goofy dad type, and once we get a few issues into the story, I don't really think he develops all that much as a character. And tied into this is my critique of Hickman not making Peter even remotely scientifically minded. He's just a photographer at the Daily Bugle, and that by itself isn't necessarily a problem. It's revealed later on that Peter dropped out of school to support Mary Jane when she revealed to him that she's pregnant. But even before that, Peter would still have been studying to be a scientist. He still would have been the science-loving kid who went to the science demonstration where he would have been bitten by the radioactive spider that would have given him his powers had the Maker not intervened. But without that, this version of Peter doesn't really have anything to contribute to the story outside of being Spider-Man. He just kind of goes wherever he's told to go and fight the bad guys. Peter isn't the one who's driving the plot forward. But let's move over to Mary Jane, and I want to start off with a change for her character that I actually really like. That being Mary Jane's career. In this version of events, Mary Jane has started her own PR firm, and I really like that. MJ going from a model to then working to improve the image of a company feels like a natural progression. And this is actually something I hope Marvel might bring over into the main continuity. I do feel like it's time for MJ to move past being a model/actress. But unfortunately, we don't really get that much of MJ working in PR in Ultimate Spider-Man. While she had a promising start, helping Ben and Jonah start their own newspaper, I do feel like she ended up being reduced to the wife who blindly supports the hero. Seriously, there's one moment after Peter had his first real fight with Mr. Negative when Peter gets home battered and bloody and finds MJ waiting for him. Peter gives a small explanation of what happened, trying to soothe whatever worries MJ might have, and then Mary Jane's response is to ask him if he wants to fool around. And that's not the only instance of this sort of thing happening, and by the time we reach the end of the story, MJ kind of feels like a little more than a cheerleader for Peter who can't keep her hands off him. A far cry from the strong entrepreneurial Mary Jane from the beginning. And then there's Harry Osborn, but to be honest, I don't really have any complaints about the way Harry is portrayed. His characterization is pretty much the only one that I find really solid. However, my criticism lies in Peter's relationship to Harry, because in the original comics, Peter meets Harry in college, but here the two meet after Peter becomes Spider-Man and encounters Harry as the Green Goblin. And I know that kind of makes it sound like I'm saying it's different from the original, so it's bad, but that's not my intention. What I'm getting at is that the premise of this new Ultimate Universe is that someone, the Maker, went back in time and prevented just about everyone who would become a superhero from becoming a hero. So, unless I'm missing something, Peter and Harry should still have met in college. And speaking of people Peter should have met in college, let's shift our attention to Gwen Stacy. Because I don't really like Hickman's version of Gwen. In this version, Gwen is Harry's wife, and after the death of Harry's parents, she becomes the CEO of Oscorp. Oh, also, this version of Gwen is Mysterio, or at least one member of Mysterio. And Hickman's version of Gwen is this ruthless businesswoman who is dead set on getting what she wants, everyone else be damned. It just doesn't feel like this is the same Gwen Stacy. And I hate that I keep saying this, but in the original comics, Gwen was a kind and caring person, and something I think a lot of people forget is that Gwen was also a science major with Peter, so making her this ruthless, uncaring CEO feels like a weird change. Honestly, Hickman's version of Gwen feels a lot more similar to what's been done with Liz Allen in the main continuity, which is why I think if Hickman made this character Liz Allen instead of Gwen Stacy, the characterization would have been so much better. And again, I'm not saying it's bad because it's not the same. I'm saying that these two characters are supposed to be the same person, so why does it feel like they're not? It honestly makes me believe that Hickman isn't familiar with those early 60s and 70s Spider-Man stories. Because the premise of this universe is that it's a branching timeline from the main 616 continuity, so characterizations and events involving certain characters shouldn't be that much different. And I'm going to get kind of pedantic here to emphasize that point. In the first issue of Ultimate Spider-Man, it's revealed that Peter's parents died and he went to live with Aunt May and Uncle Ben when he was 15. But in the main continuity, Peter's parents died when he was a toddler at most, and he grew up never having truly met them. So if all the Maker did was prevent the spider from biting Peter in the first place, then I think it should follow that Peter's parents still should have died when he was a baby. And unless I'm missing something, I believe that this shows Hickman isn't familiar with the early Spider-Man stories. And I am admittedly being very pedantic about this detail that doesn't really matter or impact the story in any way. My point is that Hickman seems to disregard his own premise for the universe in order to make changes that feel very counter to who these characters are supposed to be. But on the mention of the premise behind the Ultimate Universe, there's another piece that I have yet to mention. See, when Hickman set up this new universe, one of the things that he established is that it would happen in real time. Meaning that if you have a new issue coming out every month, then there would be 1 month between those issues in universe. And while this certainly can work and has worked in the past, it doesn't really work for modern comic book storytelling. Because way back in the 60s, when Marvel was just building their main continuity, it was meant to be that books were happening in real time. That's why Peter Parker originally graduated high school only a few years after his debut. But that worked for those comics because each issue was meant to be its own contained story. Yes, there were overarching characters and developments, but the specific story would be introduced and wrapped up in a single issue. That's not how modern comic books function. They have one arc drawn out over several issues, often ending on cliffhangers every time to entice readers to read the next issue. And Ultimate Spider-Man tries to do both of those simultaneously. It draws out the story across multiple issues, really the entire 24-issue run is one story, but then it has each issue taking place in a different month. And that's why the pacing feels really weird. Because an issue might end on a cliffhanger, say Tony Stark showing up or Peter and Harry being revealed to be captured by Kraven, and then the next issue picks up the following month. So then in order to resolve the cliffhanger, there has to be some sort of flashback, which breaks up the flow of the story. And then it also means that certain plot developments are happening between issues that we never actually see happen. Richard ends up taking the original Picotech suit and becomes Venom, but we never see him put on the suit for the first time. Or when the Parker family has to go into hiding after being attacked by Mr. Negative's demons, we don't see them figure that out. We see one panel of them fighting the demons, and then the next issue they're hiding out underground with Mole Man. Or Otto Octavius becomes Superior Spider-Man between issues, something that was only kind of hinted at, and then he just shows up as another Spider-Man. But then Hickman never does anything with that. Otto just becomes Superior Spider-Man, and then the title ends. And that actually segues nicely into the discussion about what Hickman intended for the Ultimate Universe, because the rather disappointing ending to his Ultimate Spider-Man story created a lot of talk about how he always intended it to last more than the 2 years it got. So he was trying to set up a bunch of plot threads for future writers to explore. But this brings me back to my point about Hickman having really interesting ideas, but not always the best execution of those ideas. Because he's the one who decided on having this universe move in real time, while also putting in a natural 2-year time limit. Because part of the story of this Ultimate Universe is that the Maker is trapped for 2 years before he can re-emerge and fight the heroes. So that kind of naturally seems like the point at which this universe would end. So having that ticking clock built into the story and then moving the story in real time kind of negates any sort of longevity this might have had. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing by itself. I like it when a story has a natural conclusion to it. But this natural time constraint made the pacing of the books feel jarring in a modern comic environment. And that is more or less what I think about Hickman's Ultimate Spider-Man. I could go on about how I would have changed what Hickman did, but I don't really see the point in doing that. The book is over and the Ultimate Universe is coming to a close. The final thing I want to touch on before I sign off is how fans reacted to Ultimate Spider-Man. Because, like I said, early reception was very positive, but that seemed to mostly come from fans liking Peter and Mary Jane being married. And I still see people online bringing up how good Ultimate Spider-Man was compared to recent Amazing Spider-Man comics. And they always bring up how it was because Peter and Mary Jane were married. But like I said, Ultimate Spider-Man started out strong, but then significantly petered out and had a very rushed and frankly lackluster ending. And having Peter and Mary Jane being married with kids didn't actually do anything to make the story better. And I would say that's the takeaway from everything I've said. Countless Spider-Man fans want Peter and Mary Jane to be together, but there are those who seem to believe that simply having them be married makes the comics good. But hopefully I've demonstrated with my criticisms that just because Peter and Mary Jane are married, it doesn't automatically make a comic good. Because there's a lot about these comics to criticize, but there's also a lot about them that makes them really good. And that's why I believe Ultimate Spider-Man to be just fine. Thanks for watching. Like many readers, I really liked Ultimate Spider-Man when it was starting out. I thought it had some real potential, but it ended up being kind of disappointing. But I want to hear from you. If you've read Ultimate Spider-Man, what were your thoughts on how things played out? And I'm also curious to know what changes you guys might make in order to make the story better, just because I think that would be a fun conversation to have. And if you want more videos taking a look at comic books and superheroes, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because I've got some more content along those lines coming up.